Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. We'll be spending the next couple of hours talking about ancient civilizations and ancient wisdom we can apply to our modern lives. And this is a series, so if it's something we're discussing today you're not familiar with, it is probably covered in a previous show. As I always say, Micheila is a trance channel, and I don't discuss any of the questions or topics with her ahead of time, so that she can, so her conscious mind doesn't interfere with the information in any way. But she is a trance channel, so we'll be speaking directly to the guides. So whenever you're ready, we can start.
All right. Okay.
Okay, so who is with us today?
We have the Council of Light.
I want to now, in the previous shows, we've discussed a variety of topics, and we've addressed the Great Flood in detail from many perspectives, and we've also gone into the Anunnaki lineage as well as the reptilian lineage as well. And so now that we have all of that foundation behind us, I want to revisit some of the original topics we discussed in some of the earlier shows and go back to the time of the Great Flood and establish some of the identities of individuals around that storyline. Now, in many ancient Mesopotamian myths, Sumerian myths, as well as biblical texts as well, we have different storylines with different names. So different names, for example, in the Bible, they use the name Noah. In Mesopotamian myths, they use Utnapishtim, for example, which they both have very similar flood myth storylines. And we also discussed before how YAHWEH was a collective of reptilian beings, and how reptilian beings tend to be at the top of mountaintops as well. And then, of course, Noah, in the biblical text, seems to have been helped by YAHWEH to survive the flood. But there's also some conflicting information that I want to clear up, because as we've discussed in one of the earlier shows, the Mesopotamian or Anunnaki myths or stories tend to suggest that and we've discussed this before, how the Great Flood was orchestrated as a result of a nuclear event on Nibiru, as well as events on Earth. And in the Mesopotamian or Sumerian or Anunnaki storylines, it talks about how Enlil wanted to wipe out humanity on Earth, but largely because he felt like we had become more corrupt, and the text some refer to as noisy, and also at the same time Enki was opposed to it. So the Anunnaki met together to decide whether or not to allow the civilizations on Earth to be eliminated through the Great Flood. And Enki and several others were for doing it, and Enlil were for it. And Enki had a love for humanity, according to the text, and was opposed to it, but ultimately he was outvoted. And so in those myths, they suggest that it was Enki who helped Utnapishtim or Noah or Ziusudra so there's three different names that are used for Noah, to survive the flood and to continue forward humanity. So there are all these different stories. One where YAHWEH, which we've discussed as a reptilian being, saved Noah. Another one where Enki is the one who saved Ziusudra, I think it was, in that particular storyline. And of course, in the Mesopotamian myths, that character also is called Utnapishtim. So first thing I want to clear up is the individual who saved Noah, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, was that Enki or was that YAHWEH? Or is there some other understanding here that we're missing?
Well, perhaps the context of the story is misleading humanity, and we always like to remind you that in any ancient translation, it is not always an account of what happened literally on the planet at this time, because those who were recording these various events we're doing so through the translation of symbology. And this may be why there are multiple names and perhaps what seems to be different timelines describing the exact same event. Because remember, you are dealing with multidimensional beings that existed on the same planet during the same period. So what we think is easier to understand is that there was a malevolent force that was focused on suppressing the power of humanity. And in so doing, we're creating a lot of interference on the planet, and much of what we have spoken of before in regards to technology, for example. And of course, we must also account for the various planetary events and different frequencies that were incoming at the time. Even though each story has its own character, what we want you to consider is that this represents not one, but many. So you might ask, was there an actual Noah who was incarnate on the planet at the time of these events? And we would agree, yes, that Noah was somewhat an oracle and a translator himself of information. And in describing what was about to happen in these events, perhaps he was not fully aware that he was translating from a force that may have been a bit more malevolent. So the idea of being saved also must come into the conversation, as we've been alluding to the idea that humanity has been led to follow saviors or gods or goddesses in many respects. And this is also a part of the presentation of these stories in symmetry, is there was an all-knowing, all-wise and supportive God or entity that was giving information to those who were preparing others for events that would follow. And while certainly these events led to the same outcome, perhaps it wasn't necessarily the best information to be sharing at the time. In other words, it seems as if Noah was a noble individual who was able to support the rebirthing of the human population. But the account of the story that we want to share has more to do with the polarity of darkness and light, and different malevolent and benevolent forces being involved at the time, because certainly there was a great focus on genetics. And this, while not being obvious in the story, must also be understood. This seeding that had happened prior to these events was something very important to those that were observing the earth from afar. And so a great many came on ships, for example, and involved themselves in the trajectory of the earth's future.
Okay. That all having been said, so you're saying it's a general theme and it's been translated into these different stories. But as we discussed in the past, has any of that changed now that we have this foundational understanding? For example, from the past, we discussed that it was primarily Anunnaki who caused this great flood. Is that still correct?
Oh, certainly it is. It is an influence that has continued on, but perhaps more so we should say that you are still existing in the same timeline reality and in the same dimension in which these timelines existed before, and they have yet to fully change.
Okay. And was it Enlil primarily, and with some other groups in the Anunnaki, who were responsible for the orchestration of the Great Flood?
We could say yes. Of course, we know you understand that it is never easy for us to, in a linear fashion, place any one race in responsibility, because there were a great many on planet Earth at this time that had also found themselves in difficult circumstances and were attempting to claim the earth for their own. And because of these great many influences, what resulted was a cataclysm.
Okay, but what we discussed in previous conversations about the reptilian beings was that they actually wanted humanity to be around in order to, because they were sustaining themselves due to their connection with the human race and the reptilian aspects of the human race. So were the reptilians in any way involved in this Anunnaki plot or process to cause the Great Flood, or were they on the opposite side?
You are correct in what you are saying. What we would like everyone to remember is that regardless of whether or not the reptilians were interested in ensuring humanity's resilience, they were attempting to change the frequency of the earth to their liking. So this has to also be accounted for in this story, because although we could certainly say that the Anunnaki were the driving force in all that occurred, even those that were present that were attempting to change the earth for what they deemed the better were also somewhat involved in its demise.
Okay. But not directly, because so if the story is correct, Yahweh, quote unquote, saved Noah. So in Yahweh being a collective of reptilians, or was that just a segment of the collective of reptilians who wanted to save humanity, and the rest, or a lot of the rest, were wanting to eliminate them as well?
Well, again, we want to clarify that saving humanity may be an interpretation that is a bit broad in its scope, because ultimately what the Anunnaki were most interested in was the value of the human DNA, especially the ability to shift humans into an expression that was more purposeful for them, as opposed to allowing the original evolutionary path that humans were on to continue.
Okay, since you brought it up, let's discuss DNA for a moment, because now, DNA, as we have been taught anyway, it looks like a strand that coils around each other, similar to two snakes. Is that really what it appears as, at least the physical DNA?
The physical DNA does moderate itself because it is shape-shifting just as much as you are in your evolutionary process. But certainly we could say that a DNA strand is similar to this in that it is holding a specific frequency. And in that frequency, you might see the mirror reflection of what you are describing to us in the snake iconography, which has a great deal to do with the raising of life force.
What we've been taught about how our DNA, physical DNA, appears is that it looks like two coiled snakes, essentially, coiling into each other. So it's just a spiral, essentially, of two what could be also shown as two snakes. And of course, in our medical institutions, we have that iconography of two snakes coiled as well. Is that the fact that the DNA appears as two coiled snakes, is that in any way related to our reptilian genetics? Why does it look like two snakes? Is that just a coincidence?
Not necessarily. So we wouldn't put the idea of the two coiled snakes together necessarily with the reptilian collective in relationship to your DNA. We see it more representative of the dynamic of the movement of the great spiral, which is a universal frequency that all beings are connected to. Yet we understand the point you are attempting to make here is that humans have been somewhat swayed in the way they interpret their physical bodies, the way they understand the workings of mind, through the teachings primarily of reptilians, because they have been in positions of power having to do with things like education, for example, as well as certain movements on your planet, like government and medicine, as you've brought to our attention. But do we think that the reason the DNA looks this way is because of their genetic influence? Not wholly or necessarily.
Okay, so it just happens to be looking that way for some other separate reason, then, not related to reptilians at all.
Correct.
Okay. All right, going back to the Great Flood story and all these various characters we mentioned, is it reasonable then to say, even keeping in mind what you said earlier, that Enki, in general, loved humanity and wanted humanity to survive and was opposed to the Great Flood?
Yes, we agree.
Okay. Now, after the Great Flood happened, according to the ancient myths about the Anunnaki, it's said that they regretted, well, except for Enlil, they regretted their decision to destroy humanity. And Enlil eventually was brought around to see the wisdom in the survival of humanity and to rebuild the human race. Is that part true?
It is true. However, we could shed some light on perhaps the reason for this beyond what has been offered in the story at hand, because any time that an entire race or a planet is attempted to be destroyed, if it is looked at in a physical sense, it is never going to accomplish the goals of those with the ill intent or malevolent focus. And this is why everything is energy. So even though a physical structure may be completely destroyed, all that has culminated to bring it together energetically will still exist, and the imprint of it continues on. So knowing that the Anunnaki had also been a part of the human seeding and were present, their influence was present within human DNA, this became one of the focal points of their regret, because that history of the destruction itself would have affected their race equally as it did humans. In other words, history is not segmented and somehow compartmentalized to the race in which it happens to. Everything is shared through the universal grid system, such that all races have the evolutionary benefit from all that is co-created. And this is often a short-sighted part of the evolutionary process of physical races. And remember, the Anunnaki who came had to hybridize. And they lowered in their dimension enough to perhaps not remember how universal law affected their own planet and their own race. So there were many regrets, but certainly we think from their evolutionary standpoint and through their ancestry, they realized that they only caused more problems for themselves than to benefit anything.
Yeah, that does make some sense in terms of the ancient storyline anyway. It said that one of their regrets was that they had created, or they believed, essentially the storyline says that they created humanity from this primitive group of people that existed, which we've discussed in detail in previous shows. And so they regretted destroying their own creation was part of the reason. And also they still needed humanity essentially to operate as workers for them. Is that part what you're getting at, or part of it?
It is true. However, their genetics had now, with such close proximity to your own, become integrated. So a part of them had died right along with you, even though they had the ability to leave the planet, for example, and then even come back in a different form. That doesn't negate, let's say, what they had created within themselves and also within humanity.
Would that still be true today with the various world leaders who have this Anunnaki reptilian genetic doing so much to essentially the same thing, wipe out the human race through floods and wars and various means? are they also being affected because their genetics are closely tied with ours, and is that affecting them in a similar fashion?
It absolutely is. And there are many reasons even beyond what we are stating, because whether you are Anunnaki or whether you are reptilian, if you are here on planet Earth, you are in a form quite different than those that exist beyond. And there are still attempts to keep contact with home star systems and planets, because there has been evolution and there has been healing. And many of the Anunnaki who are still here have truly lost perspective of why it is so important for them to maintain this connection to those that they knew before. Even though they believe that they are somewhat a superior race, they have taken on a more earthly focus and presentation, as if they are somewhat segregated from the others. And everything that they create here or have a hand in destructing is not only affecting them in a detrimental way, but also sending signals back to their own home planet that are somewhat karmically focused, meaning whatever they are doing here, it still has a bearing on the evolution of their race elsewhere. But this doesn't seem to be at the top of their minds, of course, because here on planet Earth, the focus through the mind especially limits a soul's ability to remember its astral history, as well as tapping into the understanding of the Akashic records. And that is what is most affected. So any destruction anywhere throughout the universe, especially that which is done with purposeful ill intent, is finding its way into the spiral of time through the universal grid, and even going back directly often to the race that has created it. And here on the earth, you must also consider the genetic tie. So we've alluded to this multiple times in our conversations, that the close proximity of various races with humanity has created somewhat of a hybrid presentation. And that doesn't mean necessarily that these beings are doing very well, because they're attempting to, we'll say, modify their structure through you. And if you are the ones who are being lowered in your vibration, or taken off planet, or somehow compromised in your DNA, it is always having a mirror reflection or mirror act upon their own DNA pursuits.
We've talked in the past about, you mentioned that only the individuals at the very top of the global leadership are the ones who are at a stage of reptilian and Anunnaki bloodline, that they can still shapeshift, and they whereas majority of the world leaders don't have quite that much. And many of them are just unwittingly following the rules or the requirements of these few handful of people. Now, so when we're talking about these handful of people who are at the very top of the control system, who have so much reptilian and Anunnaki lineage that they can actually transform into reptilians, are we talking about individuals like Bill Gates, or are we even farther up the chain like the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, or are these people we don't even know, that we never hear of?
Well, it is both. Certainly the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers have the reptilian DNA wound within them, and it is quite evident, we believe, in their humanoid presentation oftentimes that they can show up in that form. The bloodlines that follow these two races, they are certainly in the upper echelon families that you find that are causing the most hardship on planet Earth, but they are also the ones who are being affected the most by their own actions. And it is why we believe there is such an urgency to continue them forward, because even though they feel fear and have also been weakened somewhat in their DNA and physical presentation, they have a belief in the power of their own lineage. And what they are attempting to do is bring it to somewhat of a primary frequency, well beyond where it can be affected by any human beings. And in order to do that, the human beings who are here have to be lowered in their frequency. And we want you to think of it this way. They are well aware that they have hybridized with you and vice versa. And that is why the focus on the DNA is so intent, because the more they lower the frequency range of human DNA or scramble its signal somewhat, the less they are going to be entangled with it. So it's somewhat like self-preservation, keeping their DNA in a very pure state, they believe, and not being affected, they believe, by their own activities. They're actually untangling themselves from you far enough, we'll say, or strong enough to still be able to control and receive the energy that they need without being somewhat affected in the way that they have been.
So when you say they, you're referring, just to be clear, specifically to families like the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, correct?
We are, but of course there are varying levels of intensity and hybridization within what you've called government agencies and these various families, because the close proximity is the first go-to that we'll always use. There are many well-intending human beings who get involved in certain government efforts, for example, or in banking, or a variety of different collective energies, and find themselves becoming very enmeshed in the negative energy that is there unknowingly, because their consciousness is somewhat interrupted and restricted. It is the same thing that's happening at large, or has happened at large, on your planet over the last many, many decades. But there are some who are waking up out of this as well. So we always have to include the entire picture. What you may be noticing, for example, in some of your government settings, is that there are individuals who stand out, who are presenting ideas that seem quite opposite of the norm, or maybe are revealing truths that have been hidden for a very long time. And it's, we think, somewhat addictive to want to follow these individuals and believe that they are going to solve the problems. And we think that that's the mistake that humans are making. What you're actually seeing is someone in the midst of a reptilian energy, or in an Anunnaki bloodline, awakening out of the hold on their DNA. But it doesn't always mean that in the system that they are in, they are able to make the changes that humanity wishes them to make. So these are two separate things, we believe, that sometimes get blended, because collective consciousness, it is extremely powerful. And if it is okay, we will share a bit about collective consciousness to help humans really understand what it is, because it seems very elusive and hard to define, as there are many collectives that humans are connecting to, even as channels. Collective consciousness is not one thing. It cannot be linearly defined nor stagnant. Collective consciousness is very malleable, it's very pliable, and it works upon a vibrational match. So if there are a group of reptilians who have been leading the way in a certain area on planet Earth, what you can assume is the intention there is very lower vibrational. And that collective energy is going to pull others who may have similar lower vibrational intents. For example, not looking out for the betterment of humanity, but looking out for the betterment of self. Now, these individuals may not be corrupted in their DNA or have any necessarily lower vibrational energy in their system, but because of their intent, get pulled in, and for a time become a part of that collective consciousness and are changed by it. So this is the problem we see, is that there are so many that are forming collective consciousness on your planet, and collective energy is good. It's powerful, but it can also be used in the wrong direction. So intention is everything, we believe, and it's a good message for humanity at this point in its transition, to ensure that intention is always clear, that you are checking in with yourself daily to ensure that your intention is not self-focused only, but focused somehow for the collective good. This will keep you, we believe, clear and aligned, and not having to deal with the influence of many of these families, we'll call them.
Now, with regard to altering our genetics so that it doesn't affect these individuals, such as the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, was that the whole purpose behind the Human Genome Project and companies like 23andMe collecting all of our genetics in recent decades?
Much of it, yes. We would say even 99% of it. There are some people out there that are doing things that are intentionally good, because the DNA is so powerful, and we believe there are many who have come to the planet even with missions to reverse much of the damage that has been done to humanity through the actions that you speak of. However, yes, a great deal of research and focus has been placed upon human DNA because of the seeding process, and because there is so much intergalactic history and information that exists within it. When the reptilians, for example, are looking at human DNA, they have dual purpose. What they want is to activate the strands that are in their best interest, meaning those that are more reptilian in nature, to change the planet according to their comfort level and what they desire to co-create in the future for themselves. At the same time, in order to do that, there has to be a diminishing of the other strands of DNA, and that's exactly what has happened. It's what we have been speaking to even in our previous conversation, is that the reptilian focus has become so strong, some of it dark and some of it light, that you've forgotten the rest of who you are. And there is an incredible bounty of information, a wellspring of beautiful characteristics that could blossom and come to the surface if humanity would only remember their ability to activate it.
There are some theories running around the internet. I'm not sure if they're accurate or not, suggesting that the swabs that were inserted into people's noses for testing for the virus over the last few years contained some material that was altering genetics. Is that true? And is that what you're talking about here?
It is. And there are several different areas of focus here in these tests. Not one is exactly the same as another. You must look at the manufacturer, for example, because some contain certain DNA programs that will attack the cells and cause cancer, for example. Others are focused directly on the limitation, or we'll say the de-illumination of your crystalline DNA, or to program you to become more vulnerable to things like negative frequencies. There are many different avenues, we believe, in which these things are being created.
And have they been successful? Or is the human DNA such that it can overcome those influences?
Well, the human DNA in the original way that it was constructed can overcome anything. So this is primary that we want everyone to know is within you, it is possible to override or overcome anything. However, the problem is that there is still such a tremendous level of fear and unconsciousness within your collective. In order to truly understand what your DNA is capable of becoming, you must also clearly see what is being done to affect it. And there are many detoxification protocols we know that have been spoken about here on planet Earth. And we agree that many of these, although they are physical in nature, can be extremely helpful. Yet there are easier routes for activating the, we'll say, the overriding DNA strands to the things that have been implanted within you that are lowering your frequency. These are more spiritual in their methodology, and there are some on the planet who are coded to come here and to bring these practices to the surface. It is a part of their purpose and mission, and we believe they will continue to do this. In the interim, what we believe is the most important consideration is that you're always evaluating what you're intersecting with from a physical and vibrational standpoint, because right now less is more. Unfortunately, on your planet, you have been bombarded by many things that are working against you. And it is even difficult to discern, we think, right now, especially in the area of genetically modified foods. There are new and more potent strains of toxins and frequency adjusters that are being added to certain foods, along with the possibility of interfacing with the toxins that are being sprayed in your air. So it is a crescendo effect of many ill-fated timelines that the human DNA is having to deal with. But for us, it is the purity, or that path of purity, that is always going to prevail. So in the fifth dimension, those of you who have awakened to much of what we are speaking of don't have to worry so much about the impact of everything that you are being laced with throughout your day, whether it is within the air or within the food. What you are going for is to constantly purify, to ensure that you are making discerning decisions about what you're bringing into your body, what you're bringing into your environment, what you're allowing in your energy field. That is the first step, we believe, to stepping out of some of these old timeline patterns that are similar to the Anunnakis that we have been speaking of. The enslavement of humanity has happened in a great many ways. And it is continuing to happen right now beneath the radar of your conscious minds. It's limiting your potential. And anytime your potential is limited, you become enslaved by those who are doing the limiting.
So have the especially these reptilian Anunnaki beings at the top of the control system in society, like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, have they been successful in their efforts to alter human DNA, especially over the last few years, so that it's producing the results that benefit them more? Or are they still treading water or not making progress?
Well, this is a difficult question for us to answer because we have to look at it on an individual basis. Each individual human is at a varying level in terms of their DNA modification. But on the whole, here's what we believe. As opposed to being genetically modified, which you have to a certain degree, what we concern more about is how you've been limited in your access to the DNA. So for some of you, it might be easier to understand that you have been taught there are only 3 strands of DNA and the rest are dormant. And because of that belief, you are not using your entire physical and energetic structure as one. And that, we believe, is the true key, because regardless of how much you're modified and by what, that entire suite of DNA is a 12th dimensional library and powerhouse of information for healing that can happen automatically when it becomes truly illuminated. So we know the next question will be, how do we illuminate the 12-strand DNA? Well, you are all somewhat on an organic trajectory to do that regardless, because it's simply how you were structured. When you arrive in a certain dimension, like the third, for example, you don't have a reason to use all of the DNA strands that are at your fingertips. It doesn't mean that they stop working on you. It simply means that the information that exists there might not be immediately helpful for you. But we're speaking of an organic third dimension. You have not been in an organic third dimension. You've been in a third dimension that has been programmed and filtered with many distortions and toxins. And because of that, you truly need all of those other DNA strands and the information within them to override what has happened to you. So can a race be genetically modified? Yes. But can a race, if having access to all of its DNA, easily overcome that? Absolutely. And we have hope because we're seeing such dynamic change going on within the vibration and consciousness of many humans on planet Earth. It does not mean that the choices are necessarily following the level of awakening that has happened. And there is always a lag time between when a soul becomes fully aware of the choices that it's making and when it begins to change its lifestyle. Simply because it is so much to deal with right now. It can be overwhelming. But certainly we concern as much as we have hope, because we know that dependent upon the future choices that you make as a collective, you can find yourselves in the same timeline again. And with an age of technology as advanced as what it has been on your planet, this concerns us even more. Because again, if we go back in time and we look at some of the Anunnaki technology and how it was designed, we really see that coming back to your planet again in a very stark mirror reflection. And this would not be something that we would choose or want for you, even though we believe technology can be wonderful. So the choice is yours, in other words. Each individual is making its own choice as to how it intersects with the timeline that you are on as one. But those choices all go into a collective bank account, we'll call it, through which your entire physical reality is being shaped. And we can see many, many potentials and options. But again, we'll conclude with the hopeful part. There are so many potential timelines that humanity has birthed that to us reflect the fifth dimension and even beyond. And those are the ones that you want to gravitate to with all of your heart in order to fully ground.
Now, when you're referring to technology, are you referring to things like artificial intelligence, or are you referring to things more like energy technologies or weapons or frequency devices or chemtrails, HARP, or all of the above?
Well, all of those things. Our greatest concern is remember, the Anunnaki were creating technology to interface with the DNA and the human structure. So artificial intelligence has the ability to keep humans operating outside of their divine plan, outside of their organic connection to source, and truly outside of their ability to access their own consciousness. And in many timelines, this has been the case. We see the presence of many of those on the planet today. The question is, will they come to full fruition? And we don't believe that they will, but we are hoping not. But ultimately, they could be changed as well to become more benevolent in their focus. So we're often comparing and contrasting here the Anunnaki, for example, versus the Atlanteans. And the Atlanteans had incredible technology that interfaced with the human structure. But it was so benevolent and so loving that it was constantly upholding coherence or a specific vibrational frequency that was in the highest and best for all. That was the technology that became corrupted. But if technology like this were to interface with you and attempt to lower your vibration, you can see the obvious problem that many of you are facing.
Now, projects like the Human Genome Project and various other genetic projects and companies in recent decades, at least what they report to us is that they seem to be studying and quantifying the physical strands of DNA. Are they capable, and have they been also analyzing higher dimensional strands of DNA? Is that something they can even do?
We don't believe that the scientists on your planet, at least the bulk of them, actually have the quantum equipment or ability to be able to study the DNA in its purest state. It's not to say that there haven't been some very incredible advancements in this area. And keep in mind, when we're speaking about quantum, we're going beyond time. So much of what is studied is actually the carbon-based strands related to your human lineage and bodily functions, various patterns that have been passed down from generations, and truly how to transmute those, which we think are all, they all deserve merit. At the same time, we are always alluding to the crystalline DNA, which is a vibrational reflection of each physical strand. And we think this is truly the wave of the future. And it is related to sound, because if the crystalline DNA is held as a vibration or a frequency, then it also carries a specific sound. And if that sound can be mimicked or somehow used to blend the two, the physical and the crystalline strands, you will see an incredible amount of advancement on your planet. So we are encouraged, we'll say, by some of the focus here. At the same time, we know humanity has a long way to go. And there again are many hybrids and cosmic families who have decided to reincarnate into this timeline for that very purpose, to bring some of these technologies from other planets to your own.
Is the crystalline DNA the primary reason why, even in spite of all the carbon DNA manipulation that's occurred, that humanity is still able to maintain or able to maybe recover the integrity of their original seeding?
Certainly, it is a very big part of what you are stating, because the crystalline DNA, it is your link, your connection to universal energy. So we have alluded a great deal in these conversations to pyramids and various portals, and how the 369 pattern holds an unbroken connection to the universe, somewhat like a cellular phone. And this is how your crystalline DNA were designed, very much like the inner temple, holding a specific frequency that should not be broken, that helps you to navigate the earth with galactic wisdom, or bringing in certain frequencies and energies that can transmute physical things. But unfortunately, these strands, we typically say this, we use the term dormant. We say they have gone dormant on you. It doesn't mean that they are not functional. When we use this terminology, we are attempting to relay the idea that many have no idea that these crystalline strands even exist, nor do they understand their power. And belief is a very significant thing, because unless we believe something to be true, we don't have the access to it that we need. And so we think the information that is coming forth through channels like this, for example, and others on the planet about the crystalline DNA is extremely important in the evolution of humanity, and the ability to not only bring in technologies that support the healing that you desire, but also being able to activate your own inner technology.
Well, if science is not advanced enough currently to be able to analyze the crystalline DNA, then what is the junk DNA that they're referring to that they feel is dormant and irrelevant to our human makeup?
Much of it is carbon. Much of it is carbon. And we do want to make the point here, going back to your original analogy about many of these families who are at the upper echelon of these hierarchical structures being the ones who are funding, for example, this research or overseeing its direction. And that is often why it doesn't present the true results that you are going for, because the idea of junk DNA is something that has been scrutinized for a very long period of time. But our question is, have you truly made any progress in this area, even though it's been prophesized about and spoken of, and now science and research is beginning to agree that it is something to understand? Is it really allowing each human to make a connection to that energy? So there's still a lower vibrational cap, we might say, on some of this information that is distorting its truth and value on your planet.
And we discussed in previous conversations about the whole Agenda 2030 that the world leaders are orchestrating, which has many moving parts, essentially to restructure society into something that they can control better. Now, just recently, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, announced that they're moving the Agenda 2030 to 2020 over the next 2 years, basically by 2026, 2025. So why the acceleration to such a short period of time, what they intended to do in 10 years?
Well, to go back to what we have said previously, their acts are actually backfiring on their structure. And this is noted. There are several different reasons, and let's bring them all to light. First, to be reptilian hybrids, or any type of hybrid on a physical planet going through this level of transition is not easy, because even though there's been a great focus on limiting the human DNA, even though there has been tremendous effort to genetically modify humans, those that are here that are attempting to sway the planet in their direction have truly not achieved their end result. And because of this, they're losing their ability to access their own primary DNA vibration, which is either reptilian in nature or Anunnaki in nature, for example. But regardless, that is going to cause an ill effect within their own bodies, and they know this. So to move the agenda along is really coming out of fear and an inability to thrive in their own bodies that they are coming to realize is an uncomfortable truth. Also, we want to suggest that time is an illusion for these individuals, even though humans are tracking time in the way that they do in a linear fashion, because this is a dimensional experience that they are trying to keep at play, meaning they see from a quantum standpoint the success that has been made or the progress that has been made in the direction of the fifth dimension. And this is done in many ways, through technologies, for example, through various oracles that they are in contact with, some of it from an astrological interpretation. They are seeing the possibility of humans moving out of the timelines that they truly need them to remain on. And that means they are going to shift the timeline from a quantum perspective in order to ensure that they remain in power. And again, this could be seeing the level of awakening, sensing and feeling the shift in consciousness, and also feeling within themselves the potential of success slowly fading away. But there's one more reason that we do want to bring to light, and it actually has to do with the earth itself, because many are aware that there has been a gradual yet substantial pole shift that has taken place magnetically within the earth. And this happens quite frequently, but this pole shift is a very significant one for the earth and humanity. It does have the potential to actually move you quite swiftly into a new reality. And you are the ones who are birthing this. But the pole shift has also initiated a slight shift in the trajectory of solar and plasmic energies coming to the earth. They're much stronger than what was anticipated. And those in power understand that these are agents of awakening, and they will have a very positive effect on your crystalline DNA. And indeed, that is what's happening. So perhaps they're pushing up against some very positive energies that are coming in that they have foresight of, that they know will empower humanity regardless of where they stand today. And this is perhaps the reason for many of these decisions.
So should we anticipate the next couple of years of this accelerated agenda is going to make life on Earth pretty difficult for most human beings?
Well, it certainly doesn't have to be, yet at the same time, we see the potentials that are already brewing, and want to remind humanity that it isn't necessarily just on behalf of those causing the problem. You know very much as a human collective what is going on planet Earth. Many are in resistance of it, unfortunately. Some are feeling very angry and are attempting to live their lives regardless and not pay much attention to it. And others are very ingrained in trying to solve the problem. But from our vantage point, all of this is a contributing factor in growing the things that you do not want. So we're not saying you shouldn't place attention on things that you know could be a potential catastrophic event for humanity. At the same time, be wary of how you are prophesizing these things or how you are entangling your energy in them. We think it is far easier for humanity to shift out of these difficult periods by embracing in their lives what they desire and what brings them joy, despite the decisions of those in power. In fact, we could go further and say that this is a period of great energetic siphoning. So if you are going to heal at the DNA level anything that has been modified within you, you are going to need every bit of your life force and energy to do that. And that means you are going to have to pull yourself out of all of the things that very inorganically take it away. And if every human were to do this, they would find themselves in a new reality very quickly, where it would not matter what those in power continued to do. The earth would grow into the fifth dimension in a very significant and accelerated way, because it is already here. The problem we see is that attention is being diverted away from it and to the things that are going wrong. So you're asking us, do we think it will be difficult? We don't think that the period that you're in is going to be very easy. And we have, those of us on the council, in our own star systems, walked similar transitions that have not been comfortable or easy. But this is what we have learned. The easier that we make it, the more comfortable it will be. So this is the key that we want to bring to you, is that even though this group of beings that we are referring to may have a good number of plans put in place that are already focused on creating destruction, that destruction is a vibration before it is material. And if you are tuning into that vibration constantly, and trying to counteract it, or somehow bringing it into your life in a fearful way, you may end up entangling yourself in the very things that you do not want to experience. So we believe it's far easier than many of you are making it, yet we know, as we say that with great and deep respect, that it is not easy to be a human on planet Earth at this time.
So, as we discussed in previous conversations, what you're saying is not necessarily to completely ignore the world outside of us, but be aware of those things, but live in such a way, perhaps even passively avoiding engaging with those things. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, we can go further to say that if this is a timeline that has been repeating and is playing out in the same way with new characters and new scenes, you are attempting to write your own play, to actually step out of a repeating vibration and create your own. And we know that is not an easy statement to make at a time when you are birthing new realities from things that you knew before that were such or were so comfortable for you. But this timeline that you are on, it is easily collapsing upon itself. And that is perhaps another reason why those in power are in such fear and trying to accelerate the timeline, because the level of disintegration and restriction that is going on in this third dimensional reality is tangible. Those in power know that they are losing the power that they so enjoy. And so if that is the case, if you keep yourself there and fight against the problem, or continue to make the same decisions that you have always made out of comfort, you are going to also feel the resistance and the struggle and the discomfort of the disintegration that's happening. When a timeline shift of this caliber is taking place anywhere in the universe, it's not an automatic change. Even in the 12th dimension, where time does not exist, to move into a 13th dimension takes some effort because it is not known. It is brand new. We have never been in a 13th dimension in this universe before, even though some of us have been in other universes where a 13th dimension has existed. So we are creating something that goes well beyond our comfort zone. And that means we still have to have a foothold in what is uncomfortable. The key is that we are managing both to the best of our ability, meaning if we find ourselves in an old reality, we cannot beat the drum of that old reality constantly and suffer there. We are focused on the new one with excitement and with all of our energy, knowing that if we turn back and look the other way and try to hold on, we're only going to slow the process. And so you're experiencing the same thing here as we have in many different dimensions, on many different planets, where you still have a foothold in the third dimension because it hasn't gone away yet. But the degree to which you involve yourself there is going to hold it on more. So not involving yourself to the degree that you are able, only carrying out the various activities that need to be done, while putting your focus on the new and the exciting and where you want to be in the future is the true key to managing this timeline. And here is what we can reveal. Those in power see many already doing this. They have the ability to project into future potentials. There are technologies where some of these beings can go through time warps and see what the future actually entails in different scenarios. And they know that you already have the wherewithal to move beyond where they have been holding you hostage. So that is the urgency, we believe, is you have the potential. The question is, will you believe that the potential you have exists, and will you use it to the degree that you are able?
I'd like to go back to the ancient timeline that we were discussing earlier to clear up a few more details from there. Now, it's said in many ancient texts that after the Great Flood, the Anunnaki leader, or as a god, Anu, which is where the name Anunnaki comes from. He's the father of Enki and Enlil, and he decreed that that the lands, like in the Mesopotamian area, Sumerian area, like Iraq and Iran, for example, would be the dominion of Enlil, and that Africa and those parts south of that area would be the dominion of Enki. Is that true?
It is. It is. And there were various reasons for this. One being the presence of precious elements, as well as the various dimensional realities that existed in these perspective areas.
Now, is this why we see, for example, the Mesopotamian, Iraq, Iran, those areas seem to have moved toward more of a focus toward a worship of Enlil and worship of Bel or Baal, which we've also associated to Enlil as well. And we see a lot of the ancient Jewish Canaanite religions and even satanic worship, those things seem to have developed in that area, in that region. Is that because it was associated or under the dominion of Enlil?
There is a historic significance here, yes.
Okay. And there is also some correlation in ancient texts that Egypt and the African continent in general, because it was under the dominion of Enki, is why we see the proliferation of the Egyptian civilization, which seems to be a very different energy and a very different direction than we see in Iraq, Iran, and those other Sumerian nations that were north of that area. Is that because of Enki's influence?
It is clearly a different area of focus and more enlightened, we might say, in its presentation.
Okay, we also discussed in previous conversations that Marduk was a son of Enki. That's still correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Marduk was also used as a reference as another name for Nibiru. Is that also true?
We see the terms being interchangeable, yes.
Okay. There's a lot of confusion around the different characters in these storylines, and so I want to try to clear some of that up, or at least get a better understanding of it. For example, now Enki, it was said that Enki, his laboratory where he did a lot of his genetic experimentation and just experimentation in general, he was obviously very scientifically focused and more of a peaceful person, loved humanity and his creation of the modified human that they created. But he obviously was much more focused on science and developing technologies and so on, where Enlil was more the militant, angry one of the two. But it is said that his laboratory had the logo or graphic design, essentially, of two coiled snakes, which maybe it was DNA that it actually represented. Was this true?
It is true, and let's talk a little bit about the science and the research that was being done at that time, which is a bit different than the way you might explain this terminology today, because it is far different, especially regarding quantum analysis. If you are looking at the DNA and the hybrid nature of humans, you are assuming to look more at physical characteristics in this timeline, different races, for example, and how they would present in a physical sense. What Enki was attempting to do is to understand the workings of the genetics in relationship to cosmic races well beyond the Earth. So much of the hybridization that took place around that period of time came from many cosmic families who re-entered, and and had prominent roles in these various civilizations, whether they be known as gods or goddesses, or whether they had come from Atlantis, for example, or even some of the Lemurian light teachers who appeared in this period to help train humanity on the inner technology as it was understood in their own civilizations or star systems. So this was more like alchemy and even magic, we might say, where a human could understand its entire Akashic records and tap into the knowledge of many of its home star systems or planets through the methodology of breath, or through the understanding of various, we'll say, spiritual technologies or modalities that were being used at the time.
So I want to just talk a little bit about Egypt in general. And Egypt is said to come from the Greek word Egyptos, and Egyptos is said to be a contraction of the Greek word hygietos, which is further from the word God Ptah, which means a place where the projection of Ptah was manifested. Of course, Ptah is one of the earliest gods of Egypt. And if you look at the hieroglyphic depiction of Ptah, it also has this spiral DNA or two snakes coiled in the name itself. And there is some belief or writings that suggest that Ptah was actually Enki, just a different name for Enki in his later years, that he was one of the first gods of Egypt. Is that correct?
We believe that this is a lineage, in other words. So certainly we can say that Enki is a part of that lineage. But there were many, similar to how we have explained Yeshua, for example, more like a collective of beings who were representative of the geographic region and what it stood for.
Okay, so what you mean is that Ptah wasn't Enki? Ptah was part of a group of people that Enki was associated with?
Correct.
Okay, so a lot of storylines don't make sense if that's the case, and so maybe you can help me understand that, because it's also said that Marduk, who is the son of Enki, was also Ra, because in Ptah's lineage, Ra was actually Ptah's son, one of his sons, and but it's also in the Mesopotamian or ancient Sumerian text suggested that Marduk, who was a son of Enki, was actually Ra, who was a son of Ptah, who was supposed to be Enki. So help me understand that lineage there.
Well, there are many who would have claimed Ra as a part of their lineage in this day because Ra was seen as a very powerful god, especially related to some of the understandings of plasma and the connection of the earth to the sun. But we don't necessarily see Ra as a direct descendant or part of the lineage of Enlil. We believe that this may have been skewed in the story somewhat, and we would place Ra more within the Egyptian collectives than we would in participating with others.
Okay, I didn't say, I don't know if I said Enlil, I meant Enki. So you're saying Ra and Ptah were not part of the lineage of the Anunnaki then?
We are saying that they were a part of the lineage of the Anunnaki, yes.
Okay, but they weren't actually Marduk and Enki, correct?
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
So if they are part of the lineage of the Anunnaki, how were they related to Enlil and Enki? Was there any relationship at all, or were they just a separate group of people who came to Earth at a different time?
Well, keep in mind that the gods like Ra, for example, who came to the earth, would have carried multidimensional DNA, some of which was connected to the Anunnaki, and especially to have come to intersect with those on the earth. So this accounts for the connection and the lineage here.
Okay. There's a lot of confusion then because, for example, Marduk, the son of Enki, in the various Mesopotamian storylines appears to be a very violent, aggressive individual, not at all like Enki in that sense, who also approved of the destruction of humanity and many other things in many occasions, and also responsible potentially for some nuclear explosions and destructions as well. And in the Mesopotamian and some of the ancient texts, it seems to relate Marduk to Ra. So you're saying these are two entirely different individuals, but it seems like the storylines somewhat overlap. For example, the use of the various in Egypt, for example, we use the sun disk as a representation of Ra, as an example. But in the Mesopotamian text, it suggests that, and we can see some of this in the ancient iconography, that the what we think of the sun disk was actually Nibiru and not the sun at all. So help me understand how those things work together.
Well, they were both present at the time. You can see the polarity or the contrast of these two forms of iconography, where there certainly were gods that were present, like Ra, who were representing the connection of the earth to the sun, and others, perhaps like Marduk, who were defaulting more to the dominance of their Anunnaki bloodline and showing a relationship to their home planet. And just because an individual like Marduk, for example, in the story, may have been tied to a specific lineage, does not mean that he was assuming the more benevolent characteristics of that lineage, because we're always reminding those who are listening that the multiple timelines that were taking place at this period did intersect, and a lot of the influences became blended. And this accounts for some of the confusion, we believe, in the story, in that some may have been more apt to take on the characteristics of the Anunnaki, who were warlike, even though they may have come through the bloodline of an Anunnaki that was not taking that position at all.
It's said in ancient stories that Marduk wanted power, but Enlil was the primary leader or god on Earth who was given essentially dominion over the whole planet. Although Enki had Africa, for example, Enlil was essentially the authority of the planet, and Marduk was waiting until the age of Aries. So we may associate Enlil, for example, because he's depicted as the bull, and as we discussed in previous conversations about the bull, the golden bull, which is used even in Wall Street as well in the financial system. But we also see Enlil, or the bull, being used in various satanic rituals as well, which all originate in the Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Iraq area. But whereas the age of Aries came after the age of Taurus, and it was the age of Aries during which Marduk was said to have taken power. And so there's sort of this Aries influence, which is a even more aggressive warlike period than the age of Taurus. Was it true that Marduk came into power at the age of Aries?
It is true. We don't believe that it was an exact momentary shift in terms of the planetary alignments that you are speaking of, but certainly this would be the case. It's very much like you are seeing today. Any astrological influence is going to draw or assemble the appropriate components on a planet in order to play out the various scenarios and timelines that would be birthed through those energies.
Yeah, the age of Aries was roughly around the time of 2024 BC, where we see a lot of evidence that there has been some sort of a nuclear explosion that occurred in that region. and even certain stones that appear to be the result. Even in King Tut's tomb, for example, there is a certain yellow-colored stone that is said to be the result of a nuclear impact of some sort. And of course, the age of Aries coming into being with such an occurrence would make sense. Did that actually occur?
There were several different nuclear events during this period, and to quantify them all would be difficult, but we want you to imagine a level of experimentation that was happening with the Anunnaki. As we have mentioned, they are very interested in technology, and especially the use of various portals and combination of elements. And some of these experiments did not fare very well for humanity. So even though there certainly were wars between various, we'll say, groups of individuals that assumed positions of power on planet Earth, and nuclear technologies were utilized and even brought from other star systems. A great deal of what you're seeing is the effect of research that was being done on certain, we'll say, groups of or collectives of beings, knowing, of course, that research could be very detrimental to the Earth and to humans.
We discussed in a much earlier conversation about how Hitler was searching for the Aryan race, and that was, to a great extent, the start of the Nazi Party, and all of that was based on his search for the Aryan race and recovering all these ancient technologies as well as rituals to reconnect with his ancestors. Now, many researchers since that time have interpreted that he was searching for Atlantis. But considering he was searching for the Aryan race, could it have been he was actually searching for the Anunnaki, or did he really not know the difference?
Well, we believe it was the occasion to uncover the history of both, even though it may not be what he was actually looking for when he set out, because remember, these timelines were intersecting. So to have uncovered one would have been to uncover both. Yet we do want to suggest a very strong Anunnaki blood lineage here that was the driving factor in the research or the discovery of these things.
Going back to Ptah and Ra, for example, I wanted to get a little bit more understanding, because there seems to be so much connection between Ptah, not so much Ra, but Ptah and Enki. So Ptah is Anunnaki, or was he some hybrid being?
We could say he was a hybrid, certainly more like an intergalactic being who came to Earth. But remember, in hybridizing and coming to a certain geographic region, would have also been predisposed to accessing some of the more prominent DNA strands and lineages of the period.
We discussed in previous conversations how there was a fifth and third dimension that were coexisting as a result of the Anunnaki and the reptilian timeline, and the ninth dimension, Atlantean civilization, came to an end at the Great Flood. But then the fifth and the third dimension continued forward, and we're still living in that timeline today. Did Ptah and the Egyptian civilization exist prior to the flood, and Ptah coexisted with Enki, or did Ptah join the Egyptian civilization at a later time after the flood?
Well, the pre-flood period is an interesting one to consider because, as we mentioned, there were different dimensional realities and the cataclysm changed that. So as an intergalactic being, what you must consider is there would have already been perhaps some presence prior to the flood to be such an important part of the reconstruction of a civilization after the flood, which we see Egypt to actually be, meaning much of what Atlantis was founded on became integrated into Egypt through those who had observed and understood it or had somehow contributed to it in an astral sense, because it wasn't just those on the ground level who were earthlings, perhaps, that were the ones responsible for the various forms of construction and our architecture and technology that was present in Atlantis. There was a great deal of support from those beyond the veil. So this individual you speak of was certainly part of a council that was overseeing some of that construction and the constant upgrade and working of it, and then came to be a part of Egypt after the flood period to somewhat connect the dots, to reunite those who may have been taken on ships during the cataclysm period and came back with a specific purpose to rebuild and to reinstate the human genome, but to also replicate some of the more important technologies that had been a part of that civilization.
Okay, just to clarify a bit further, are you saying that Ptah was in the fifth dimensional timeline with Enki and Enlil, for example, or was he one of the individuals who traveled on a ship from Atlantis along with Thoth? Because we discussed previously how Thoth was in the ninth dimension in Atlantis, and he traveled a dimensional shift into the third dimension, which was what Egypt was. Was Ptah with him, or was he part of the Anunnaki timeline that Enki and Enlil were on in the fifth dimension?
Well, somewhat both, because those who came to be a part of Egypt also were aware of the Anunnaki's presence on planet Earth, and sometimes became interconnected with what they had started or left behind. So if we had to make a determination here, we would say he was a part of the transition, very similar to Thoth.
Okay, so help me understand what you mean by both then. If he came over from Atlantis, how was he also in the fifth dimension with Enlil and Enki?
Well, remember, these timelines intersected. So the intersection of timelines doesn't necessarily mean that you would be present in physical form and knowing of and living in close proximity with another. It's very similar to what is happening today. You know of the workings of many things that are going on the planet, either simultaneous to you or have been previous to you in areas that you have never visited or with people you have never known. And this is what we are alluding to.
Okay, I'd like to understand the mechanics of that a little bit better. So, Ptah, let me just carry on a storyline here to see if I understand what you're saying. So, Ptah and Thoth were in Atlantis in the ninth dimension. Enki, Enlil, and the other Anunnaki beings were in the fifth dimension. The reptilians were in the third dimension. And the cataclysm occurred, and some of the people from Atlantis, Thoth and Ptah included, moved to the third dimension. The Anunnaki, Enki, Enlil, that group from the fifth dimension moved to the third dimension, and the reptilians also moved to the third dimension. So now they're all meeting in the third dimension. But prior to that, are you saying that Ptah and Thoth, for example, in the ninth dimension, were aware of what was taking place in the fifth dimension because ninth dimensional beings just have the ability to have that awareness?
Well, that is correct. Certainly, we could say that it's not just from an astral perspective that someone in the ninth dimension would be aware of things like this, but also to be multidimensional is to consider many of the other things that are happening on your planet simultaneously, whether it be to just have a knowing of that, but or we should say to have some type of a technological ability, very similar to what we have been stating with time travel or being able to see into the world of other realities. This was going on quite a bit in these periods.
So Ptah, although he was in Atlantis in the ninth dimension, was able to travel to the fifth dimension to interact with Enki and Enlil, for example, prior to the flood. Is my understanding correctly?
That is correct. We could say that, yes.
Okay, so he did have some sort of a physical manifestation in the fifth dimension even prior to the Great Flood.
Yes.
Okay. And so would we say the same is true for Thoth as well? He was interacting in both dimensions simultaneously?
Yes.
And so is that only possible because they were ninth dimensional beings? I imagine a fifth dimensional being couldn't move the ninth dimension, right, to have an incarnation.
Well, it is truly dependent upon the race and the location of that dimension, because universal law operates differently throughout the galactic universe. For example, here on planet Earth, there are many who have assumed a fifth dimensional existence, who are able to operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously, where they are exploring other realities and have knowledge of what is taking place on timelines beyond the one that they exist in now. This is somewhat an astral or spiritual ability, and has to be put into the context of linear time, because your planet has descended somewhat into a more material and dense reality. So it is nonetheless the same, but more instantaneous, we might say, in other locations. And remember, we're speaking of a period of time when Earth was quite different, even though there was the density, for example, of many of the activities of the Anunnaki and various reptilians. We wouldn't say the planet itself was as dense in a material sense as what it is today. So it was far easier to accomplish these various time traveled events and to be a seer, for example, than it is today.
Why are there so many coincidental correlations between Ptah and Enki? For example, the use of the coiled snake or the spiral DNA symbology in Enki's laboratory and in Ptah's name as well. And even now Ptah is also pictured with feathers or like feathered wings wrapping around his body. So the Anunnaki iconography seems to be there as well. So it would make sense what you're saying, that he was also Anunnaki. But there are so many similarities there. Is that because Enki essentially controlled or was in charge of Africa and as a result Egypt, and some of that iconography was carried forward into Ptah's lineage as well?
Some of it can be thought of this way, but there was a great deal of information that was transferred or handed down from those who were in prominent positions of power, especially to have been doing research of this caliber. Remember the importance of the DNA, and to understand it like a technology. In the iconography of the coiled snake, you are seeing the transfer of importance and focus on this very thing, even if it may not have been in the exact way. So much of this symbology represents a strong connection in the storyline, or information that may have been shared from one to another to be carried on in an important sense.
So in the iconography that's even survived to modern times, where we see the what we've been told was a sun disk, or the sun disk of Ra. In Egyptian iconography, we see it oftentimes with wings on either side, or sometimes with two snakes on either side. So we see that similar iconography even carried through to today. For example, even in the symbology of the various, for example, the World Health Organization has the disc with the two leaves on either side, which look like two wings, for example, or even two serpents or on either side as well. So should we assume that symbology that was used in Egypt, that was said to represent Ra, is the same symbology that's being used, for example, in a lot of world organizations like the United Nations, World Health Organization, and so on? It's that same iconography that's being carried forward.
Well, it is, but always keep in mind that the intent behind it may be different than in ancient times. For example, the sun disk was often used to represent also a very powerful connection of the DNA, because on planet Earth, the alignment of the sun to your own structure is what predisposes you to universal energy. It is why even today there are many who are purporting to block the sun from you, because the evolution of humanity, both from an astral and a physical sense, is very dependent upon the polar rays of the sun. These are somewhat plasmic in nature, and they feed your physical and energetic technology. There were many who were trying to capitalize upon that energy. There were technologies that were specifically built to channel solar energy to the earth, that healing chambers were built within, or ceremonies were also held within. But some of this information has been taken and somewhat hidden from you and even turned against you. So when you see today some of the more hierarchical organizations that are not creating a reality in humanity's best interest using this sun disk, they are attempting to channel those frequencies away from physical humans, or to somehow capitalize upon the energy and the knowledge that they propose to offer without allowing the collective access.
We also see somewhat similar iconography, as you mentioned, in our medical institutions as well. For example, the coiled snake with the wings at the top and the sun disk at the very center of a staff that's running down the center. Now, is that carrying back to Enki's lineage of his iconography that he used in his laboratory, that scientific lineage is carrying forward till now?
Yes, we see it as an obvious representation of the continuation of that timeline. But know also, and we alluded to this in one of our previous conversations, the iconography of the snake or the reptilian is sometimes taken in different forms or context, whether it might be seen as the DNA strand, or even sometimes the Kundalini rising has to come into consideration, because today, in your medical institutions, you would never be focused on the inner technology in order to heal. There's always something outside of you that is being offered as the healing agent for what takes place inward. This never would have been the case in enlightened civilizations. So some of this iconography that you speak of, it has been taken and somewhat twisted to represent the opposite of its original intent.
The individuals who originated this iconography in modern times, so the first time this iconography was used, were they aware of this connection of this ancient lineage, and they were using it in some way to tap into or to claim a lineage from that, even though it's being used in a very different way today?
In some circumstances, yes, but more so, we believe it represents a continuation of some of the philosophies and technologies from ancient times. But remember, these have been taken out of context in the public. We've spoken some today about those who are orchestrating ill intent upon humanity and how they are feeling fear and seem to be running out of time. You would think that they have access to incredible technologies that would ensure the continued health and longevity of their race. But what has actually happened is they have been using these technologies against you as opposed to for the benefit of themselves. So they've sort of taken the alternate path of what their original lineage had intended in terms of understanding hybridization and using these tools to, in some circumstances, better the earth.
If we look at ancient archaeological discoveries that took place either in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, we see a distinct difference in archaeological architecture, for example. In Egypt, we see very sophisticated pyramid structures, generally very clean, at least when we go back to the most ancient ones, like the Great Pyramid. Not a lot of hieroglyphs or anything like that, very simple designs. But much more sophisticated design that has withstood the test of time. Whereas if we go north of there into the Mesopotamian region, we see ziggurats that were much less sophisticated and in many cases didn't weather very well and to this day are not in very good condition. So there seems to be a distinct difference in the two regions, the one, the Mesopotamian, which was ruled over by Enlil, and the Egyptian African region ruled over by Enki. And even the two civilizations were very different. In the Mesopotamian region, we see the development of religions based on worship of satanic entities like Baal or Bel, which seems to still be prevalent today, where in the Egyptian regions we see what appears to be a more sophisticated spiritual religious belief. Is that because of this distinction between these two leaders, Enki and Enlil, that it appears that the more sophisticated technologies, even pyramid building techniques, seem to be in the regions that Enki ruled versus the regions that Enlil ruled?
It is a primary difference, and there are many reasons that we could bring to your attention as to the differences in these structures and their intent, mainly having to do with the inner versus the outer technology, which we have discussed with the reptilians and the Anunnaki, because in the regions where Enki reigned, there was still some reptilian influence, even though it was a primarily Anunnaki led region. And because of this, what you're noticing, and through some of the research that was done there, is the pyramids themselves, or the structures themselves, were created in a sound and balanced connection between earth and universe. This was important because those who used these structures were intending to not only heal and accentuate the consciousness of those who entered, but create a field, perhaps, or a chronic and constant flow of energy, the as above and so below, using the earth as a foundation or a mechanism through which this energy would be shared throughout multiple meridians, for example, and ley lines. So it was not just a technology for those who entered, nor an agent of healing or change for those in the nearby region. It was actually meant and purposely designed to affect the planet as a whole. Keep in mind, some of this goes back to Atlantis and how those in the civilization were tapping into the earthly elements and connecting them with the elements of the body to create a coherent field. This was a part of the purpose of many of these structures. That was not the focus in the regions that you are contrasting here. It was a more self-serving type of collective in which the structures were not built with the benefit of the whole in mind. Some of them aimed certainly to heal, but many of them were more destructive even in their presentation. Where some of the pyramids in Egypt we know were created in the perfect harmonic resonance of a mandala, the signals within these structures in Mesopotamia, for example, would interrupt a harmonious flow and focus on a very linear and singular aspect of the human structure. Even we might say some were built in recognition of the prominence of those in power, which would never have been the case, even though certain structures are named after gods or goddesses in ancient Egypt. The name was not the important part of the structure. It was what the structure aimed to do for the entire planet that became the most important focus. So we could go on, but we are confirming what you're speaking of here.
And so the reptilian influence that you're referring to, is that why we see the reptilian iconography more prominent in Egypt than in the Mesopotamian region, for example, in the headdresses of the pharaohs and such?
Yes, they were seen as some of the enlightened and revered teachers that came in to advise even about some of the pyramid construction, as well as various healing technologies and modalities.
Now, we also find, we discussed in a previous conversation about the reptilians and the Naga and how their architecture is very ornate and very detailed, where they depict the ancient stories and such in their various buildings and structures, where in the most ancient Egyptian pyramids, we don't see iconography at all. But we start to see iconography in later generations of the Egyptian civilization. Now, is that in any way related to maybe the reptilians being not so involved in the earlier construction of for example, the Great Pyramid? Whereas when we move to, for example, the Temple of Hathor, we see very elaborate, ornate depictions and pictorials and hieroglyphics. Was that the reptilian influence that came into that society that caused that change in their architectural design?
Well, remember, the reptilians were great storytellers. It was important for them to not only create a structure, but to imbue the structure with Akashic relevance or some very prominent message that would be imbued within all who would enter. And this was also a sonic vibration that was being created, even though a certain hieroglyph, for example, may be seen in separation of something else. They all fit together perfectly like a puzzle and would create a vibration or a sound that was somewhat like a download. Although every individual who assumes to be healed as they enter is going to integrate that download a bit differently, it is all very purposeful in the design. So if a pyramid is connecting a soul to its one true self, there must be a variety of different mechanisms and technologies that create a sound that is undetectable by the human ear, but resonates within the field of the individual receiving it, such that they can awaken to something very prominent coming from their own history. And this is certainly an influence of the reptilians throughout time and throughout history. They are very well known for carving very meticulous structures in detail in order to evoke a specific vibration.
It seems to me that there are two distinct spiritual/religious directions that we see coming, one out of the Egyptian region and one out of the Mesopotamian region. The Mesopotamian region appears to have followed the lineage of the fallen angels or the Anunnaki and the various teachings of magic and the Kabbalah, even black magic and a lot of the demonic worship that's taken place even to this day. That Mesopotamian region seems to have been very heavily involved in worship of satanic gods. Even the Canaanite civilization that also followed later on was very heavily involved in the worship of Bel or Baal. Whereas in Egypt, we see a very different religious or spiritual direction that seems to be a bit more sophisticated, also a bit more scientific in some respects. And it seems to me that it might have been the origins of, for example, what is Freemasonry today, or has become Freemasonry. Is that correct? Am I on the right track?
You are, yes.
Okay, so did Freemasonry originate with better intentions? It appears today that a lot of the Freemasons, not the average person who may reach a third level Masonic degree, they're just regular people, but I'm talking about the real high-ranking Freemasons seem to be a very malevolent organization. Did it start out malevolent, or did it just become that way?
It did not start out this way. In fact, some of the original Masons will go back to ascended masters like the Order of Melchizedek. But the information that was shared was so pure and so powerful that it was looked to be corrupted or hidden from the general public. And much like many of the religions as they have evolved on planet Earth today, it is important to siphon energy from groups of humans who become very involved collectively in these organizations. And this is indeed what has happened. In fact, if we look at Freemasonry up to the highest levels, even the initiation there is not following the original rites and rituals of those who began this organization, which dates back beyond even the origins of Earth and can be carried off planet.
So when you say goes back beyond Earth, so you're talking about the original foundational principles of Freemasonry date beyond Earth?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so what is it today then? Is it has it lost those foundational principles, or is it still using those but in a more malevolent way?
Well, it is a little bit of both. In other words, some of the most powerful and pure practices have been lowered in their vibration and have been replaced with language or various incantations, for example, that are focused on degradation of the self, or praying to something beyond the self, which we know, of course, follows the theme of much of what we have been talking about in these various topics. At the same time, some of the original teachings do still remain. It is just that those who are teaching them have taken them somewhat out of context. It's very much like, for example, yogic practice. There are a variety of different yogic teachings today, and there are some gurus who are creating their own yogic practices through channelings or interpreting the teachings of others. But it is always the intention behind the teacher or the level of consciousness through which they are operating that dictates whether or not the practice maintains its original state of purity or is somehow taken into a lower vibration. And that's ultimately what we observe about the Mason collective. It is been unfortunately assumed, we might say, by those who are more aligned with personal power and wealth and accumulating energy than necessarily teaching what was a more benevolent modality and ability to activate positive energy within the self.
Was the Freemasonry that was developed in Egypt a reptilian influence that created that or brought it into being, or was it an Anunnaki reptilian? Essentially, was it created in a what was the lineage or the individuals or energy that brought it into being?
This is originally an reptilian, reptilian focused and created methodology. Yet, of course, keep in mind that reptilians, even though they have come from their own home star system, have traveled throughout the galactic universe and have shared their teachings and been influenced by others. So it is difficult for us to say that it holds only reptilian knowledge and influence, but those who came to Earth were sharing all that they had learned on their travels throughout the universe.
So the original Freemasonry in Egypt anyway was, as a result, must have been a very mind-based teaching, I assume, if it was reptilian primarily. Is that correct?
We agree. It is always focused on either the control of the mind or the use of the mind in order to individually or collectively create a specific result.
So how did Freemasonry, being something that contains universal knowledge, become such a secretive, private society as opposed to something that was taught to everybody?
Well, because those in power who were not necessarily benevolently focused understood the magnitude of these teachings and immediately took it to underground societies where it was taught for a period of time to those who are interested, but then became eventually influenced and changed and focused more perhaps on monetary collection as well as the accumulation of power. We've talked somewhat in these transmissions about the shifting of humans from a mind focus to that of emotion. And we want to introduce the concept of language or words, which are very, very powerful when it comes to evoking a specific response, both with universal energy as well as within the self. This has been some of the biggest change, we believe, that has been made in some of the legendary prophecies and magic that is shared in these institutions. Very slight changes in language can cause huge adjustments in how energy flows, how it impacts an individual, or whether or not it is able to be utilized for good intent as opposed to evil. And we can take this even into some of your modern day chants. While some of the original Sanskrit chants were very particular in their sound, some of this today has been changed, and a very slight incantation or shift in vocal tone or word or sound in a Sanskrit chant can bring it into a lower range or even a guttural presentation that evokes the wrong spirit. So all of this has to be taken into consideration.
Now, it seems to me that these two distinct directions that started in ancient times in Egypt and Mesopotamia have carried forward to modern times. And it still looks to be very distinct in that we see a segment of the population, and primarily world leaders and secret societies, that are very much focused on the worship of satanic beings and the use of Kabbalah and other kinds of dark magic. But we also see groups of world leaders who are much along the Masonic lineage and practices associated with that. So are there two distinct groups of in our society today that are controlling society, each with their own different philosophies, or have they come together as one today?
We believe there is some overlap, and that is what has taken place gradually over time. And we do agree in these two various factions and how they obviously show up throughout history and still somewhat exist today. But behind closed doors, what you might find is there is some negotiation here, and certainly some overlap because the focus is exactly the same, as we have mentioned: self-preservation, the ability to weaken human DNA to tap into the most valuable and powerful aspects of it for self. When all of these intentions collide, you have a group of individuals who, with great deal of power and accumulation of information, are able to take over an entire society.
And so is this why we see a lot of overlapping iconography today? For example, as we've discussed many times, the snake in the claws or the talons of the eagle representing the Mesopotamian religions, Enlil, the Anunnaki, versus a snake, which is the reptilian influence, which, as we've said, is we can correlate with the Masonic traditions. So is that why we see that blending of the iconography in modern times and in many global institutions in the medical profession and so on?
It is, but also make no mistake, it is in the best interest of those who wish to take over your planet to continue to reinforce a frequency of war, however that best comes about. So in this iconography, that is exactly what you are seeing. It's a vibrational transference or account of the energy of ancient times that is used widely in order to influence this type of vibration. And of course, many of you can see on the earth today how there is such a dramatic focus on dividing the human collective in order to continue that warlike mentality, whether it is a war of physical magnitude that is taking place in a geographic region, or whether it is the wars that have been evoked within families and between loved ones. This is the type of energy that creates density upon which those in power thrive. Not only does it weaken human potential and keep them in a lower vibrational consciousness, it ushers in a material density within which these beings, we will call them, are able to succeed.
So are these beings on these two sides producing these wars collectively to ultimately to control humanity? So they're working together to produce that same end result, or are they actually at war with each other because they have different agendas?
Well, we think it's a little of both, again, because you are looking at a wide spectrum and a scope here of various beings that have influence from various timelines, meaning within their bloodlines, they were focused on certain activities and others were not. But the bottom line is whatever war is created is equal somewhat to a human sacrifice. In other words, we hate to use that terminology because we know it can sound fearful, and many humans today have come to terms with the idea that these types of rituals continue on behind closed doors. But what is even more important to us sometimes is what you do not recognize that happens before your very eyes, which will demonstrate the amount of ritualistic types of planning and abuse that takes place both collectively between and also in opposition of these two races.
Okay, and is it fair to say then, since you brought that topic up, that the human sacrifice aspect of it is going back to the Mesopotamian region civilization under Enlil, that was practicing black magic and human sacrifice? Is that aspect of what war has resulted in today versus Egyptian civilization was not that?
That is correct.
Okay. And that's why we see the eagle, which represents the Anunnaki Mesopotamian Enlil civilization, being the primary iconography of nations such as the United States. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
So how would you explain then that the U.S. supposedly in 1776 was founded by a group of individuals who were largely Freemasons?
Well, the Freemasonry is not necessarily limited to the actual group of this name. So what we have to explain is there are Freemasons who don't necessarily participate in what is known as the more public accounts of this group, but in a more secret and underground way, practice the original teachings to their benefit.
Okay, just to make sure I understand that. So are you saying that some of the original founding fathers were practicing a more benevolent, maybe the more of the original Freemasonry that came out of Egypt that was not as malevolent, but then there were also some who were maybe involved in the more Mesopotamian human sacrifice, that sort of part of the religion as well?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And so the religions have kind of blended a bit over time, is what you're saying.
They have.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to finish there for today, and we'll come back and we'll resume that topic next time. Thank you, Micheila.
All right.
And thank you all for joining us for another Channel Revelations. If you want to check us out on various other platforms, we're also on many podcast platforms as well as Rumble, and some of our videos are being deleted on YouTube. So if you don't see a video on our YouTube page, you may find it on Rumble or a podcast as well. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time.